Chapter 18, The Renaissance through the Baroque. Learning objectives. Explain how humanism informs the art of both the early and high Renaissance. Discuss some of the ways that the encounter with other cultures impacted the long-established artistic traditions of China and Japan, the Americas, and Africa. Describe how the manner of style is different from that of the High Renaissance. Define the Baroque as it manifests itself in both art and architecture. Introduction. Between about 1400 to 1500, Western Europe experienced a rebirth of Renaissance of classical values. That's the values of Greece and Roman art. By the time of the Illuminations, for les tres riches heures du Duc de Berry, human beings are represented as casting shadows, and the setting portrays some perspectival accuracy. In this painting of the Limburg brothers, we see the original Louvre castle in its entirety, and an interest in the zodiac with astrology at the top of this. We also see a personification of the cosmic forces as we see God in his chariot driving the sun across the sky. Below, we see peasant workers, feudal workers that are tilling the soil. And so we're seeing shadows being cast on the ground, and images of people in this time period are starting to become a little bit more realistic. One of the walls of the ancient castle is preserved in the Louvre today. This is the wall facing the city with the support pillar of the drawbridge, the main entrance to the Louvre. Another example of the Limburg brothers. See this interest in the zodiac with the anatomical zodiac man. Notice how the zodiac has channels of the energy systems like chakras moving up the body of the figure. During the Renaissance, they experienced the Black Death. It arrived in Sicily around 1348 and quickly spread north. Since it was carried by rats, no population was safe. Following this, feudal rule gave way to centralized forms of government. An influx of workers to the city led to more manufacture and trade, as well as a growing intellectual class. Humanism was a belief in the unique value of each person conceived by Petrarch in the 1330s. Donatello's David was the first life-size nude sculpture since antiquity. Rendered in contrapposto, as in classical posing, the subject seems to be self-admiring. One of the other things that led to this new society, this golden age during this rebirth of the Renaissance, was that trade was happening along the Silk Road. This led to a better middle class through this ability to work within guilds, to manufacture goods, and to have trade along the Silk Road. This is Petrarch, the father of humanism. One of the earliest humanists rediscovered the letters of Cicero, a Roman poet of the first century, wrote that secular, non-religious thinking didn't necessarily mean that one didn't believe in or have a relationship with God. He argued for the immense moral and practical value of the study of ancient philosophy, history, and thought. The influence of Cicero upon the history of European literature and ideas greatly exceeds that of any other prose writer in any language. Cicero introduced the Romans to the schools of Greek philosophy and created a Latin philosophical vocabulary with neologisms such as eventia, humanitas, qualitas, quantitas, and essentia, distinguishing himself as a translator and philosopher. This is the work of Donatello, and believe it or not, this is David, a much more effeminate David than that created by Michelangelo or Bernini. So it's rumored that Donatello used a female as a model for this portrait of David. The hat that he uses on Donatello Seems kind of out of place since the rest of the figure is in total nudity. But this could be a reference. Some scholars believe that this is a reference to established Greek hero Hermes, because Hermes wore this same type of hat. This is the San Morel del Carmine and the Francasi Chapel. Can you imagine walking into a chapel like this and seeing all these beautiful paintings and frescoes on the walls and ceilings? We see the altarpiece right underneath the window. What a beautiful architecture and beautiful renderings of frescoes on the wall. This is the work of Masaccio, and this is the tribute money. And it comes from the Bible. Jesus in the center, a tax collector is coming to get taxes. It's titled the tribute money. So Jesus says, go look in the river and you'll find a fish. And they open the fish's mouth, and there is the tribute money. Masaccio was one of the first to use the one-point perspective that was developed by Filippo Brunelleschi, one-point perspective that focuses that vanishing point on the head of Christ. The early Renaissance. Filippo Brunelleschi developed a system of geometric linear perspective. Painter Masaccio incorporated what he learned from Brunelleschi and Donatello to create works such as the tribute money. Figures are modeled with a kind of chiaroscuro and have a more realistic weight and perspective as one point. In the North, artists desired to render believable space in the most realistic detail. They developed oil paint that could reflect light in a way that fresco and tempera could not. We're going to look at Roger van der Weyden's The Deposition. So that's Christ coming down from the cross. It has emotionality in common with the flagellation of Christ. Look at the beautiful color. In the Northern Renaissance, we often see saturated color, beautiful reds and striking cobalt blues. Look at the attention to detail in the drapery and the folds. They really love the way that the fabric moved, the textile quality. Look at the beautiful pattern and textures in that garment there to the right of Christ. So we see Christ coming down from the cross. His body is hanging limp and lifeless. One of his arms is hanging down. And we see that image repeated in the Madonna figure. Her arm is repeating the same arm shape in the body of Christ. So this is Golgotha. We see the skull down at the bottom. Women are crying in sorrow. And if we look at the close-up of one of these women, we see a realism, texture, and color, and tears rolling down the cheek of the women that are suffering in sorrow. So these are things that would be very difficult to do with tempera or the regular fresco, but could be done with this new oil paint by adding linseed oil to the paint. This is a very different kind of work by Piero della Francesca. Piero della Francesca was much more of a mathematician, and you can see how he's laid out his composition. If we diagram the painting, we can see how mathematical and precise his composition was. If we extend this line upward from this point, it crosses past the foot and the hand of this figure on the right. It established this square here. And if we dissect that square diagonally as well as horizontally and frontally, it creates the axis for the body of Christ, who is tied to this pillar and being flogged by this figure right here. So a much more mathematical, linear perspective of what's going on the floor as the orthogonals move up towards Christ in this way. The early Renaissance. The Medici family highly influenced the early Renaissance as they essentially controlled banking in Florence. Lorenzo de' Medici studied Neoplatonic thought, which argued that contemplating beauty could transform love in a corrupt soul to spiritual love. The Medicis greatly influenced Botticelli and gave Botticelli lots of books. They studied Neoplatonic philosophies. This is the birth of Venus. This is the story of the Greek goddess, the goddess of love, who was created in a virgin birth by Cronus. Parts were dismembered and thrown into the sea. Up from this foaming of the sea was the birth of Venus. So we see a mixture of these classical stories during the Renaissance. Sometimes these classical stories were incorporated into the Christian paintings themselves. Sometimes they were just these classical motifs were created on their own. The birth of Venus. The story is that of Venus' birth. She is being blown towards the shore by Zephyr and being welcomed by the character of spring at the shore. It was thought that the sea was fertilized by Saturn or Cronus, which was understood to be a metaphor for the creation of a perfect being by divine power. Not only birth of beauty, but birth of the soul. Venus as the figure of divine beauty is a divine symbol for the way these themes are delivered to the world. For its ties to Platonic theory come via writing Symposium, a dialogue in which he argues that love is the essential ingredient of the philosophic path and search for wisdom. The High Renaissance. Leonardo also painted The Last Supper. Around the same time that he returned to Florence, he produced Madonna and Child with St. Anne and the Infant of St. John the Baptist, as well as the Mona Lisa. The power of the Mona Lisa rests in its psychological depth, leaving the sitter an aura of ambiguity. Leonardo liked to experiment with his painting techniques, and this was not a traditional fresco method where an artist would paint on wet plaster. He mixed a pitch or a kind of a tar-like substance in with his paint, painting it on dry plaster. And as a result of that, this painting has not weathered well over time. If you look at it really close up, you can see that the paint has been peeling and it's degraded the quality of the painting. And this is probably the most famous painting on earth, the Mona Lisa by Leonardo. That's a very small painting too. This is a painting by Leonardo, the Annunciation. The angel Gabriel is announcing to the Virgin that she is going to be with child. A linear perspective. These are orthogonals that are pointing to the horizon line and the vanishing point. What's unique about this is that Leonardo is incorporating classicism from the Romans with this sarcophagus here that comes between the angel Gabriel and the Madonna. Now, what's unique about this is on Roman sarcophagi, the garland represents a death and rebirth. And so we've seen the shell, the birth of love, of the birth of Venus here. So we see this symbolism, this Roman mythology and symbolism is being incorporated into this very Christian story. And this is a close-up of the garland. Notice how the garland's hanging between two spirals. Now we're going to look at some Roman sarcophagi. This symbolism of the garland of death and rebirth is carved into this sarcophagus. Oftentimes, the garland would be supported by a sacrificial animal, like these rams right here. Sometimes it would be a sacrificial bull. Death and rebirth in the Roman sarcophagus. This is the Sassetti Chapel, and I wanted to show you this because it's a beautiful chapel with a wonderful altarpiece by Domenico Ghirlandaio. The altarpiece here is the adoration by the shepherds, the patron donors here on both sides. These would be the people that commissioned the work by Domenico and his brother David. It's unique in the Renaissance tradition We often see the birth of the Christ child appears on the ground, but one of the interesting things about this is, again, we see this Roman sarcophagi with the garland right here. Now, Ghirlandaio liked to paint himself into the painting. And so here he is as one of the shepherds. And with one of his hands, he's pointing to his heart. And with the other hand, he's pointing to the Christ child. As his hand points to the Christ child, notice it crosses the path, the line of the garland, which represents birth, and it passes across to the Christ child. We see the Greek architecture of classicism, and again, the triumphal arch here, where there is a parade that's passing through that triumphal arch to visit this new spiritual leader. What's interesting, up here, there is a figure flying in the air over this arc area. I believe she's about to ride out Surrender Dorothy. Raphael arrived in Florence during a time of Neoplatonist domination. Art began to exceed reality rather than imitate it slavishly, as Plato had initially argued. The School of Athens is the most famous of Raphael's paintings in the Stanza della Signatura in the Vatican. Plato and Aristotle split the center. So this is the room of signatures in the Vatican Museum. A beautiful room with these wonderful frescoes. Raphael was probably the most talented painter during the High Renaissance. Look at this beautiful floor here with this intricate tile, very cycle-oriented, infinite tile pattern. And this is the School of Athens. So in the center, Plato with his fingers pointing upward to the heavens, and coincidentally, it's intersecting right here, continuing this line of the triumphal arch. And then the arch comes down and it goes down, and Aristotle's hand is here holding a book. It's pointing downward. The line continues down right through here. And this is Diogenes. He was a philosopher who believed that an honest person would give up all belonging and serve truth. This figure over here is Michelangelo, and this line extends downward into Michelangelo's notebook here. So all of these figures represent famous people during that time period, philosophers, artists of all sorts. And here we have the diagram, so we can see the lines of the triumphal arch are going down and hitting the ceremonial bull of Diogenes. Above the School of Athens, in the room of signatures, we see a Tondo painting on the ceiling. This is titled Philosophy. And in this written, the words Casarum Cognitio, which means know thy causes, an allegory of philosophy sitting in a throne or chair with Artemis, a sculpture of Artemis, the Greek goddess, on both sides of the chair. These are little genies or puto, little boys, part of that tradition. We know them to be something like a Cupid. Philosophy during this time period was very much into Casarum Cognitio, above all else. Seek knowledge of causes, divine inspiration, knowledge of things divine, to each what is due. Philosophy is to question and to dispute the existing knowledge in order to find the real truth out of limiting facts and to find proper path of action. Philosophy is leadership, and leadership is service to all. So that is what the philosophy was in that time period. And especially that's what it was to Raphael. Things to consider. Neoplatonism was a revival of the philosophies of Plato. And Plotinus. Plotinus, a 3rd century philosopher who argued that there were 3 hypostases, underlying realities. There was the one, the intelligible, and the world soul. The one was the highest, most perfect realm. The one was completely undifferentiated, and therefore nothing could be said about it. It fit well with the idea of God and the heavenly realm. Neoplatonism was focused on bringing together Greek philosophy and Christian doctrine. It was a philosophy that was promoted by the Medici house, who went so far as to establish a Neoplatonic academy in Florence in the 15th century. In Venice, emphasis on art was in the sensuous of light and color, and Giorgione was one of the best at this sensuousness of color. The Tempest is surrounded in mystery. Really, scholars still don't know what this work is about, but there is a nude woman and a clothed male soldier, or at least some people interpret it as a male soldier. He is dressed in Venetian garment. The soldier and the nude woman are split by a river, and lightning struck the cityscape. It features outright sexuality, which would become a subject of Venetian art. First thing we notice, the beautiful warm light that is shining down, and the greens, the beautiful color. The sky is filled with clouds, and there's a crack of lightning that is shooting down from the sky. The soldier on the left, who is looking at the woman who is practically nude, breastfeeding a child, and she's looking out right at us. So we become part of this painting in this triangle of implied lines of sight. Most art historians don't have any idea what this painting is about, but that mystery, that unknown, really appealed to the intelligentsia, or the upper class patrons of that time period in Venice. When Giorgione died of the plague at the age of 32, it is likely that his friend Titian finished several of his paintings. Titian's Venus of Urbino shows Venus as merely a nude woman, an object of desire. She may be a courtesan or a bride. So in this Venus of Urbino, Titian has moved Venus from an outdoor setting. He's domesticated her by bringing her in, and she is displayed in this golden light on a bed, making direct eye contact with us. So it's uncanny that in this time period, this idea of the goddess has been incorporated and associated with that of a concubine. Albert Dürer established the idea of the Renaissance in what is now Europe. He painted self-portraits throughout his career. He also did incredible woodcuts. In the image featured here, he appears almost Christ-like. So he is painting himself in this iconic format, in this iconic composition. And not only is his head, light is reflecting off of his head, but with his hand, he's pointing at his heart, as if to say that I am like Christ. It is by the love of my heart that I am like Christ. And we see this beautiful light bouncing off of him. He is very famous for his printmaking, and you've probably seen this image before. I know it appears on a lot of tombstones. He was the origin of this image, these two hands in prayer. Later in his life, in Albert Dürer's life, he had a very prolific career. He created more artworks than most of the Renaissance painters. Later in his career came the proclamations of Martin Luther. Martin Luther was extremely upset with all of these, what he thought was pagan ideas of classicism. He didn't think that religious art was a place for the images of the Greeks and the Romans. He was also really upset with the idea of indulgences. Indulgences were the selling of forgiveness. So a person could buy forgiveness for themselves or for their family member, forgiveness of sin, if they paid the right amount of money. Here we see an image of one of the popes or people of the church that are taking in coinage for indulgences of sin. This is Martin Luther posting his 95 Thesis. It is the All Saints Church, and he posted it on All Saints Day. Martin Luther had many supporters in Germany. He wrote a lot about this Reformation, and he had artists that would draw cartoons for him. He would put out small newspapers with these kinds of cartoons or these images in there. And in this cartoon, we see an image that shows Christ's forgiveness would greatly outweigh that of the papacy there. So Christ is heavily weighted. Martin Luther believed that no one could look inside another man. It was impossible for a person to give forgiveness of sin like that of Christ. This is Pope Leo X. He was born Giovanni Lorenzo de' Medici. Pope Leo X was a Medici, and that was a banking family. So it kind of makes sense that a banking family would find a way to make money from fear of going into hell. They supported the activities of the church as well as raised money for the rebuilding of St. Peter's Cathedral. One of the statements by Martin Luther was that the Pope, for his writing, he received the information from Satan himself. And it's though Satan had blown the sentences of the Pope right into his mouth. This is pretty powerful stuff at the time. What became of Neoplatonism? In the late 15th century, a Dominican monk named Savonarola, he was barracked for the damning of paganism and pagan culture. Neoplatonism was seen as heretical during the Counter-Reformation, and many artists quickly gave up this philosophy. Botticelli went so far as to burn many of his pagan work. In the Bonfire of the Vanities, we're going to look at that. Savonarola had little kids go around and collect any object that represented a sort of vanity. And he even convinced Botticelli that his classical paintings were a part of this idea of vanity. Michelangelo renounced his Neoplatonist philosophy for ascetic piety and moved away from figurative arts. Thus I know how fraught with error was the fond imagination which made art my idol and my king. No brush, no chisel would quieten the soul. Michelangelo. This is an image of Savonarola, who was a good speaker. He had a passion for fire and brimstone, and he rallied the people in Florence to give up drunkenness and all their wickedness and sin. He denounced clerical corruption, despotic rule, and the exploitation of the poor. And he created the Bonfire of the Vanity. In 1495, in Florence, he refused to join Pope Alexander V's Holy League against the French. The Vatican summoned Savonarola to Rome. He disobeyed and further defied the Pope by preaching under a ban, highlighting his campaign for reform. So he spoke against the church, and he accused them of taking money from unfair taxes. Generally, he accused them of corruption. As a result of that, the people in Florence, they slowly became bored with him, and they wanted to reopen their taverns And the Pope kind of undermined him and got the whole town to go against Savonarola. And they ended up hanging him and burning him in the same place as the bonfire of the Vanity in the Piazza della Signoria. And this is what it looks like today. Bartolomeo Diaz and Christopher Columbus explored areas not well known to Europe in the late 15th century. In China, Japan, Africa, and the Americas, established traditions were transformed by European encounters. Marco Polo became an administrator to Kublai Khan's court during a journey to China in 1275. Many scholar painters of the Chinese court were in exile but sought to keep traditional values and arts alive. This is Cixio ink orchids in the Yuan dynasty. During this time when Marco Polo was with Kublai Khan, the Huns, they tore down part of the Chinese wall and invaded China. And this is a painting of an orchid that represents, this orchid is growing beautifully, but it's growing without its soil. And it represents this time period when the Chinese had lost control of their country. The Ming Dynasty was established around 1368. At this time, Dong Qichang wrote an essay about the history of Chinese painting and its division between northern and southern schools. Hundreds of birds admiring the peacocks is of a northern school. Its style is refined, decorative, and colorful. It symbolizes the emperor being admired by court officials. The southern style emphasized self-expression as seen in Poet on a Mountaintop. So these two different styles are almost exact opposites. We see this highly refined, colorful, elaborate, ornate picture representing hundreds of birds admiring the peacock, and this would represent the court's admiration. And this is a Poet on a Mountaintop, very different, solitary, out in nature, the mist rising up through the valley. And it is from a poem, white clouds, sash-like, wrap mountains waste, the rock terrace file in space, distance, a narrow path, leaning on a brambled staff, far and free I gaze, to the warble of valley brook, I will reply whistling. So it's like a Zen poetry, contemplating in solitude on a mountaintop, looking at the vastness, expanse of natural space. Zen Buddhism took hold in Japan during the 13th century. This Haboku landscape is painted in broken or splashed ink, an abstract representation practiced by Chinese Buddhists. So here we see the accidental, the splashed ink, the uncontrolled, and it's very sparse. Look at all of the emptiness, the empty space in this painting. A new genre of screen painting known as Namban developed from the arrival of Portuguese and Dutch traders. A popular theme was the arrival of foreign galleon in Kyoto Harbor. These paintings are unique in presenting a convergence of multiple cultures. Now we're going to look at the art of Mexico and South America. One of the most important centers was the commercial center called Teotihuacan. It is laid out in a grid system and links the pyramids of the sun and moon together. We're going to look at the Avenue of the Dead as it played an important role. At its height, it likely was the home to 200,000 people. And so we have two pyramids, the sun and the moon, and in between it is the Avenue of the Dead. So they had ritual activities. Teotihuacan is a word that means where men become gods. So if you can imagine the processions, the parades, the ritual ceremonial activities in these areas, I think that would lend credence to the idea that this is the Avenue of the Dead. The mountain behind it is thought to be one of the inspirations for the Pyramid of the Moon. So we see a ziggurat-like terraced pyramid happening in Mexico. The Maya in the south were never unified into a single entity due to their occupation of several regions. Their calendar system featured a 260-day cycle and a 365-day cycle, the convergence of which occurred 52 years. Aztecs merged with the Mayan and Toltec cultures. They worshipped a goddess called Coatlicue. The Aztec Empire was conquered by Hernan Cortez in 1519 to 21. A combination of military technology, betrayal, and disease led to the downfall. This is the image of Coatlicue. She was a mother goddess and a terrifying goddess at that. We see two snake heads that come together, and she has a dress of serpents. And in this, she wears a belt of hands around her neck with a human skull in it. So this was a terrifying image, and the Spaniards didn't want to destroy it because they thought it would bring them bad luck. So they buried it, and that is how the statue has survived. It was later discovered. An incredible image, very primal serpent image there, Mother Goddess. Blood sacrifice prior to the arrival of Cortez had wiped out almost the entire population of the Casas Grandes. Diego de Duran's History of the Indies of New Spain contains an illustration of Cortez' technological superiority over the Aztecs. So yeah, the metal men there, they were well armed as opposed to the spear bearers at the time. Hernan Cortez was a Spanish conquistador who explored Central America, overthrew Montezuma and his vast Aztec empire, conquered Mexico for the crown of Spain. In Peru, we're going to look at the Mocha style culture. They were great potters. They made incredible pottery, and they hand built, and they incorporated mold making into their work. When I was in Lima, Peru, I went to these collections where there were giant galleries full of this work, shelf upon shelf of Mocha style Peruvian pottery. And a lot of the pottery is based on their cultural activities, their everyday lives. So you see pottery that tells a narrative of what they felt was important in their society. Part of their belief was of a shamanistic belief, and they believed that the shaman was born from a leopard. The spirit of the jungle would appear to the shaman in two forms, as a jaguar-like leopard or as a giant serpent. These are called stirrup vases, and they were for storage of water. In times of great drought, it's important for community to have the ability to store water. And so these stirrup vases did just that. Here we see a shaman who is kind of in a meditative, possibly a trance-like state with a jaguar or leopard image on his head, kind of looking upward as though he's looking up into space. We see the stirrup handle in behind him. So these are low-fired pieces of pottery, and the carbon has gone into the burnished clay, so it has a slight reflective surface to it. Inca culture emerged around 1300. Their masonry featured granite blocks that fit so closely together that they have withstood earthquakes that destroyed structures created later. The stone walls of the Coricancha in Cusco are yet extant and stood by a temple that would have been originally covered in gold or turquoise. So what I think is interesting about this is that we see a Dominican monastery that has been built right on top of this original Incan culture religious site. So some of these religious sites have moved from different religions, but the site is still sacred. And sometimes churches are built right on top of older traditional areas of worship. This is in Ecuador, the Temple of the Sun, and that's me standing there next to it. That's been several years ago. It's a great example of the stonework these ancient cultures were capable of. And this is Machu Picchu in Peru. This is a home, like a settlement for a group of religious people. This was a religious community that lived high up in the Andes Mountain. Lastly, we're going to look at mannerism. Mannerism was a style based on invention and the technical virtuosity of the artist. A lot of times, mannerist is known for very exaggerated proportions or exaggerated posture. Michelangelo's Last Judgment showed chaotic swirling line and grotesque proportions. Tintoretto's Miracle of the Slave heightens drama with dynamic composition and contrast. So this is Michelangelo's Last Judgment, and we're going to look at some close-ups of this. And this is on the wall of the Sistine Chapel, 1534 to 41, fresco, the Vatican Museum in Vatican City. First of all, when we look at Christ, who is judging the damned, we notice that it's a beardless Christ, very unique. Michelangelo has possibly drawn on the classical figure of Apollo. Look at the similarity in the nose, and I think that explains well the beardless image of Christ. Also, Christ is like a Greek athlete, very muscular. Michelangelo paints himself in the flayed skin of Bartholomew, his skin was removed for he's known as being a Christian martyr. But if we look at a portrait of Michelangelo, we can see that he has kind of hidden his self-portrait in the face there of Bartholomew's skin. Artists love to incorporate all kinds of unique things that aren't readily apparent initially. You kind of have to discover and look into it more and more. There's all kinds of things, references and symbols in these Renaissance paintings. This is this figure who is welcoming people into hell, the damned. This is Minos, King Minos of the Minoan society. He was in Michelangelo's version and Dante's version, that he was kind of the master who decided what level, what depth of hell, what ring of hell a soul would be condemned to. King Minos there with donkey ears and a serpent biting at his genital. In Dante's vision, Minos is appointed the task of listening to the sins of souls who reveal everything to the demon. Upon learning their sins, Minos indicates to them their destination in hell by wrapping a serpent tail around his body as many times as the appropriate circle. Here we see the mannerist style, rated movement and proportion. This is called the Madonna of the long neck. In this, we see the mannerist style. It's known for the elongated proportions, highly stylized poses, and lack of clear perspective. Pontormo's Entombment in 1528 in Florence. Again, we see the exaggerated postures that mannerism is known for. Okay, I think we're going to stop there.